was 22 when I took the overnight shift at a travel stop off I-70, somewhere in the flat middle of Kansas. Not a glamorous job by any stretch. I rang up coffee and cigarettes and scratchers from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and I ate a lot of vending machine sandwiches, and most nights the only real challenge was finding ways to stay awake. The place was one of those older regional stations, not a big chain, nothing corporate, maybe 1,200 square feet total, including the back stockroom, with a drop ceiling and fluorescent lights that had a low persistent hum you completely stopped registering after about the third night. The parking lot was lit by 2 tall sodium vapor lamps that made everything look orange and slightly sick. The nearest town in either direction was about 9 miles. My manager, a woman named Patrice who I genuinely liked, had told me during training that the overnight shift was easy. Boring, she said. Nothing happens. She said almost nobody comes in between 2 and 5 am. She was right, almost nobody. It was the second week of November, a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been listening to an election recap on the small radio I kept behind the counter, not national, just a local race, and I'd finally turned it off around midnight because I was tired of the same results repeating. The parking lot was empty under the orange lights except for one car, a tan 4-door sedan parked at the far pump, the one closest to the road. It had been there when I arrived for my shift at 10:45, and I'd noticed it then and filed it under broken down. Owner got a ride. I hadn't thought about it again. Around 1:15 in the morning, a man came in, mid-40s maybe, grey, zip-up sweatshirt jacket, dark pants, nothing particularly notable about his appearance. What struck me was that there was no car at the active pumps, none that I could see through the windows, and I hadn't heard a door close in the parking lot, which usually carries sound well on a still November night. He walked the snack aisle very slowly, not the way a hungry person walks an aisle, the way someone walks when they're stalling. He'd pick something up, look at it for a few seconds, set it back down, moved from the chips to the candy bars to the nuts, touched things, didn't take anything. I watched him the way you watch people when you're bored and have nothing else to do. He came to the counter with a single pack of spearmint gum. While I was ringing it up, 99 cents, which I remember specifically, he said, very casually, "That tan car out there at the pump. Is that yours?" I said no. It was there when I started my shift, probably broken down. He said, "Oh, okay," and then he smiled, just a little, the way you smile when someone tells you something you already knew. He paid in exact change, a $1 bill and a penny, took the gum without looking at me again, and walked out. I watched him cross the parking lot. He went directly to the tan sedan. He didn't try the door handle, didn't look inside. He stood next to the driver's side with one hand resting on the roof of the car, and he turned and looked back at the store window. Looked right at me, directly, like he knew exactly where I'd be standing. Then he walked around the side of the building toward the back, out of sight of the pump area cameras. I told myself he'd gone back to use the outdoor restroom, which was on the east side of the building and which customers sometimes used when the inside one was occupied. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. He didn't come back around to the front. I didn't hear a car start anywhere. I didn't hear anything, actually, which out there in flat Kansas in November you would. Sound carries. I watched the clock hit 1:25, then 1:30. At 1:38, I needed to go into the stockroom to get more large coffee cups. We'd gone through the supply I'd stocked at the start of the shift. The stockroom was at the back of the store, accessible through an interior door off the main floor. It also had its own exterior door on the back wall, the loading door, that was supposed to be alarmed. I say supposed to be because I'd been told during my first week that the alarm had been malfunctioning on and off for about 8 months and the owner hadn't gotten around to fixing it. I went into the stockroom. The interior light flickered once when I hit the switch and then came on steady. I scanned the shelves for the cups, and that's when I noticed the exterior door. It was unlocked, not standing open, not broken. The handle wasn't damaged, nothing was forced. It was simply unlocked, the latch bolt retracted, the door resting in the frame with the faintest gap along the edge, like someone had turned a key in it from the outside and pushed it just enough to confirm it opened and then let it settle back. We had 2 keys to that exterior door. My manager, Patrice, had one. I had the other, right there on my lanyard, which had been around my neck all night. I propped the interior stockroom door open, so I had a sight line to the front counter. I don't know exactly why that felt important. It just did. Grabbed the cups as fast as I could, relatched the exterior door and got back up to the register. I called Patrice. She didn't pick up. I waited 90 seconds and called again. On the 3rd call she answered, groggy, clearly woken up. I told her what I'd found. I was as calm as I could manage, but I was not calm. She said, in a sleepy, patient voice, that the lock on that door had been funny for a while, and it had probably just not been properly latched. It did that sometimes. She'd meant to mention it. I told her I had latched it myself. I had a specific memory of doing it during my opening check at 11:10, testing the handle after, making sure it was secure. There was a pause. Then she said I should just make sure it was latched now and call her if anything else happened, and she'd have the owner look at the mechanism. The man in the grey zip-up never came back inside. I watched the clock and the windows and the door for the rest of the shift. At some point between 4 and 5 am, the tan sedan was gone from the far pump. I didn't see it leave, and I don't know when it went. When I came back the following Thursday and mentioned the tan sedan to Patrice, just trying to understand what it was about the car that the man had been interested in, she looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read and said, "What tan sedan?" I described it, the pump it had been at, the colour, the 4-door body style. She shook her head and said she didn't know what I was talking about and moved on to shift notes. I worked 2 more shifts after that. I didn't give notice. I just didn't go back. I never picked up when they called. I've thought about that tan car probably 100 times since then. And the one thing that keeps snagging my brain is this. The man asked me if it was mine before he went around back. Like the answer mattered. Like the answer changed what he did next. This happened the summer I was 26, making the drive from Nashville to my parents' place in Arkansas. It's roughly 6 hours depending on traffic, and I'd done it a dozen times, so I wasn't treating it like an event. I'd left late because of work, which meant I hit the rural stretch of I-40, the part where exits get sparse and the billboards thin out, around 10 at night. I needed gas about 40 miles before the state line. I took an exit I didn't usually take and found a small station I'd never been to. It had that look of a lot of rural highway stations, kind of frozen in time, like it was built in 1988 and not much had changed. One of the two overhead lights above the pumps was out, so the lot was half lit. There was one other vehicle, an older pickup truck, parked off to the side, not near any pump, which I filed away as probably belonging to whoever was working. The sign on the door said open until midnight. It was maybe 10:20. I decided I'd go in and use the restroom while the tank filled rather than stand at the pump. Inside it was the dim, slightly musty interior of a station that had probably been cleaned this decade, but not aggressively. The kid behind the counter, I'd put him at 18 or 19, was leaning on his elbows, looking at his phone, and glanced up at me briefly when the door chimed. The restroom was through a door at the back, marked with a small laminated sign. Women's room, 2 stalls, 1 overhead fluorescent that buzzed with that particular aggressive hum that means the ballast is going. I did what I needed to do and came out of the stall to wash my hands. There was a woman standing at the sink. She hadn't been there when I went in. The restroom is small enough that I would have seen her, would have said something. And the door was heavy, a proper door with a pneumatic hinge that made a solid, unmistakable thud when it closed. I hadn't heard it open or close. She was maybe 60 years old. Short grey hair, denim jacket, jeans, nothing that would make you look twice on the street. She was standing with both hands flat on the edge of the sink, not running the water, not looking at herself. She was looking at me in the mirror, not in a way that made immediate sense, not the polite, quick glance of someone who heard you come out of the stall. She was looking at my reflection in the direct, steady way of someone who had been waiting for it. I smiled the way you automatically smile at a stranger in a small space. She didn't return it. She said, "Don't use the pump on the left side." I'd been using the right pump. I'd pulled in on the right out of pure habit. I said, "Sorry?" She repeated it. Same flat delivery, same words. "The left pump. Don't use it." And then she looked back at the mirror, at herself, not at me, and said nothing else. I said okay. I finished washing my hands. The whole exchange had taken maybe 15 seconds, and I couldn't have told you what to do with it. I walked back out to the main store, bought a water from the cooler, and the kid rang it up without looking up from his phone again. I almost mentioned the woman in the restroom. The words were right there. But something about it felt strange to say out loud, like saying it would make me look like I'd imagined it. So I didn't. I went back to my car. Right pump, right side, where I'd started. I finished filling the tank, replaced the nozzle, got back in the driver's seat. As I was putting the car in reverse to pull out, I looked across the lot toward the left pump. There was a man standing next to it. Dark jacket, I remember it was dark, and he was just standing there, not at the panel, not doing anything with the car, because there was no car at the left pump. He was standing next to the pump itself, on the driver's side of where a car would be, and he wasn't looking at the pump. He was looking at the lot. He was looking at me. I pulled out onto the highway, and I didn't look back. I don't know what was happening at that left pump. I've thought about it practically every time I've stopped for gas since, which is often, because I still drive that route. And I've never been able to find that station again. I know roughly what exit I took. I've tried twice. The exit is there, the road is there, the station is not. I'm not sure what to do with that. I've never told this one out loud before. I don't know why. It's not the most dramatic thing I've experienced, not by a long shot, but something about the specifics of it has stuck in my brain in a way I can't shake loose. I was 14, and this was back in 2009. It was spring, early May, that time of year when it's light outside until past 7:30, but still cold enough that you need a jacket. I'd ridden my bike to the Shell station on the edge of our town, the one everyone's parents seemed to have a vague warning about. Not don't go there alone or stay away from that place, just this ambient, low-level warning you absorbed without being able to quote directly. I'd gone anyway, because I wanted a Gatorade and a Reese's, and it was the closest place. There was something different about the station that evening, not dramatic, just the usual counter guy wasn't there. Instead, there was a man I'd never seen before, which in a town of about 4,000 people is genuinely unusual. He was tall and thin, with long forearms, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He had a tattoo on his right forearm that I remember clearly, 3 horizontal lines, like dashes, evenly spaced. He didn't make eye contact once during the transaction, rang up my Gatorade and Reese's, took my crumpled bills, gave me change, all without looking at my face. Not rude exactly, just deliberate about not looking. I went back outside, unlocked my bike from the rack. There was one of those old bent metal racks near the air machine, and I was crouching down working the combination lock when someone crouched down next to me. Not a crouch like they were passing by and paused, a crouch like they had walked up and chosen to put themselves at my level. I looked up. It was an older kid, 16 or 17, someone I didn't recognize from school. He wasn't from our town, I was pretty sure of that. He had the look of someone who'd been outside for a while. He said it quietly, right at my ear level, "Don't go out the back way." I almost laughed, because I wasn't planning to. My route home was straight back up the main road. I said I was going down Main Street, the way I'd come. He looked at me for a second, like he was checking whether I was telling the truth. Then he nodded, once, firmly, the way an adult nods when you've said the right thing. He stood up and walked back around the side of the building, and I didn't see where he went. I stood up and looked toward the back of the lot. There was a chain link gate at the far back corner, the kind that opens onto a service alley behind the row of businesses. It was open. Not all the way, maybe 18 inches, just enough that someone could slip through. The alley on the other side was dark, even though there was still light in the sky. It was darker than it should have been. I got on my bike and rode home fast. I didn't tell my parents what had happened, or at least I didn't tell them the weird part. I said I'd gone to the Shell and come back, which was true. When I was 19 and home from my first year of college, I brought it up with my mum over dinner, just casually, the way you bring up old things. I described it, the kid who warned me, the gate, the alley. She put her fork down and asked me, with a specificity that surprised me, which direction the gate had been on, left side or right side of the lot. I said left, the far left corner. She said okay and picked her fork back up. I pushed. I asked her what had happened out there. She said, "There was just some trouble out there for a while. It's fine now." And then she changed the subject with the kind of deliberateness that shuts down a conversation. I've never gotten more than that from her. And she is not a dramatic person. She is not the kind of woman who withholds information for effect. If she won't tell me, She has a reason. I drove long haul for about 6 years, primarily the I-80 corridor, which takes you through Wyoming and across Nevada, and I want to be upfront about something before I tell this story. Long-haul driving messes with your perception in specific, well-documented ways. Sleep deprivation, monotony, the hypnotic effect of miles of empty road at night, your brain starts filling in gaps. Manufacturing details, building patterns out of nothing. I knew this. I'd experienced it. I'd learned to distrust certain things I saw at the 2 and 3 o'clock marks of a long run. I say that because I want you to understand that what I'm about to describe, I have never been able to explain away with any of that. It was January of 2016. I'd pulled into a pilot truck stop off I-80 in Wyoming around 2 a.m. One of those big compound stops, diesel lanes, a diner that was still serving, a store, and a truck lot around the back separated from the regular car lot by a poured concrete island. I'd fueled up in the diesel lanes and moved the rig around to the truck lot to eat something and rest. Standard stop. There was one other semi near me, a white Peterbilt with Oregon plates, maybe 40 feet to my left. Running lights on, which meant the engine was running, which almost certainly meant a driver was in the sleeper. Normal, people sleep in their rigs at truck stops all across this country every night. I ate my sandwich in the cab, and I was doing the end of leg thing where you decompress. Scrolling your phone, watching the lot, just letting your mind settle before you try to sleep. The lot was otherwise empty. -5 degrees outside, wind pushing hard from the north. Nobody walks around in that if they don't have to. And then there was a figure between the trucks, standing in the gap, not between them exactly, but at the edge of the gap, positioned so that the body was in the shadow between the 2 rigs' running lights. I could see the outline clearly enough, upright, human height, facing my cab, not the other truck, just standing there in the strip of cold shadow. I watched for what I'd estimate was 30 to 45 seconds. My first read was another driver doing a walk-around check. You do that, especially in winter. Check your tires, check the coupling, move your body a little before you sleep. But a walk-around is a walk. This figure didn't walk anywhere. It stood completely still, facing my cab, hands at its sides or close to it. No movement at all. I was about to tap my air horn, just a short one, the way you signal another driver in a lot, when the figure took one step backward. A single step, directly backward, like it had decided to move further into the shadow. Still facing my cab throughout the motion, it did not turn around, it stepped back. I hit my high beams. The gap between the trucks was empty. I had the beams on within 1 second of the step backward. There was no delay, and there is nowhere in that gap to go quickly. The concrete island is solid, chest height, no openings. The ground between the trucks is open pavement, and you'd have to go around the front or rear of one of the 2 rigs to exit that space. That's roughly 30 to 40 feet either way. In the second between the step and my lights coming on, no one could have done that. It was -5 degrees. The pavement was dry. I checked for footprints in the frost on the ground around the trucks when I finally got out, about 20 minutes later. There was frost on the side of my tires and along the concrete island. There were no footprints in it. Not from the space between the trucks, not anywhere near that gap. I didn't sleep. I drove another 3 hours before I stopped again, and when I got to that next stop, a Flying J in Nebraska, I sat in the lot for a while, and just let the engine run. The white Peterbilt was still in the Wyoming lot when I pulled out, running lights on, engine running, no sign of a driver. I've never told this to another person in the industry. You know how that goes. I want to tell this one slowly, because it lasted several weeks, and because the pieces of it only started to add up in a particular way toward the end. I've had a lot of time to think about it. I still don't have a framework that covers everything. In the fall of 2014, I was 20 years old and working the overnight shift at a Marathon gas station attached to a convenience store in a mid-sized college town in Ohio. I actually liked the job. I'm a night person by nature. The work was simple and low pressure, and between midnight and about 4, the store would go genuinely quiet, a few students in, a few out. The occasional older regular who couldn't sleep, and I'd listen to podcasts and stock the cooler and feel like I had some kind of private ownership over the quiet hours. The station was on a main road, but set at a T intersection, which meant the front of the store, the south-facing wall, which was almost entirely plate glass, looked out across the street at another parking lot, a strip mall, closed at night, open sight lines from the store all the way across both lots and up the cross street. I bring this up because it matters later. The incidents, I'm going to call them that, since I never figured out what else to call them, started in early October, and they started so small I almost didn't register the first one. The first thing was the phone. We had a landline behind the counter, an old push-button model, and it rang occasionally. Wrong numbers, drunk people calling to ask if we carried something specific, vendors occasionally calling the wrong number. Normal stuff. One night around 2 a.m. it rang, and I picked up, and there was nothing on the other end. Not a dialing sound, not a voice. Breathing, regular, slow breathing. I said hello twice, got nothing, and hung up. A week later it happened again. Same time, approximately, I hung up faster. The third time was maybe 10 days after that. This time, when I picked up, I didn't say anything. I just listened. The breathing continued, calm and steady, and then after about 5 seconds it shifted. There was a sound underneath it, or alongside, that I needed a moment to identify. It was footsteps, slow, crunching, uneven, like someone walking on gravel or loose asphalt. And then from outside, not from the phone, from outside the front window, I heard footsteps pass. I looked up. A man in a dark jacket was walking past the plate glass window, moving left to right across my field of view at a steady pace, not stopping, not looking in as far as I could tell, just passing across. He was gone in maybe 3 seconds. I was still holding the phone. The footstep sound on the line had stopped. There was silence, and then the line went to a dial tone. Now, I want to be fair to myself here, the way I was trying to be fair to myself at the time. A phone call with someone breathing and footstep sounds, and then a person walking past outside, could be a coincidence. Someone passing by the store at 2 happens. It happens less than it does at noon, but it happens. The timing was close enough to be unsettling, but unsettling and connected are different things. I told myself it was probably coincidence. The window situation was harder to explain away. Starting in mid-October, I began noticing a figure standing in the far parking lot across the street. Not every night, more like every 3 or 4 nights, always in the same general position, at the far edge of the lot, right at the boundary, where the parking lot's overhead lights failed and the shadow began. Far enough that I couldn't make out a face or much more than a general outline, just a person-shaped shape standing still. The first couple of times I clocked it, I told myself it was someone waiting for a ride, but it was always between 2 and 3 am, and they never moved to a car. And a rideshare pickup doesn't take an hour. I mentioned it to my co-worker who did the closing shift before mine. She said she'd noticed someone out there too, a few times, and she'd figured it was probably the same thing. Someone waiting for a ride, someone walking home who'd stopped to check their phone. Her read was benign. I tried to hold on to that. The phone calls kept coming, every Tuesday, almost without exception, between 1:45 and 2:15 am, just breathing, sometimes with the footstep sound, sometimes without. I started writing it down in a small notebook. I dated each entry, noted the duration, noted what I'd heard. I still have that notebook in a box somewhere. I have never gone back and read it. What changed in late November, what changed the whole shape of the thing, was the night I watched it happen simultaneously. It was a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, which is part of why it caught me off guard. I'd been scanning the far lot across the street as part of my regular check, which I was doing every 20 minutes or so by then, and the lot had been empty all night. I was almost relieved. I'd started to think maybe it was done, whatever it was. At 2:17 am, the phone rang. I picked it up and said nothing. Listened, breathing, slow, steady. I looked up at the window. The lot across the street was not empty anymore. The figure was there, at the far edge of the light, in its usual spot, standing completely still. I was watching the lot. The figure was standing there, and then, slowly and deliberately, it raised one hand, raised it to about shoulder height, and held it up, fingers spread wide, not moving, just holding the hand up, like a greeting, but not like a greeting. I set the phone down on the counter. I didn't hang it up. I walked to the back office and called 911. The dispatcher was calm and professional. An officer arrived in about 8 minutes. By the time he drove through the far lot, it was empty. He came back, took my statement, walked the perimeter, found nothing. He was kind about it. He said it sounded like someone messing with the business, maybe trying to spook employees, and if it kept up I should document it and call again. He left. I went back to the counter. The phone was on the hook. I had not put it on the hook. I had set it down on the counter, not hung it up. I know this with certainty. I transferred to the day shift the following week. My manager processed the change without asking why, which, looking back on it, I find notable. The person who took over my overnight shifts quit after 3 weeks. I heard this through a mutual co-worker. I never asked the person why they left, and I made that choice deliberately. Some things you don't want confirmed. To this day, I don't know who was calling. I don't know how whoever it was could see me clearly enough across that distance to time the hand raise to my looking at the window. I don't know how the phone got back on the hook. I don't know why it was always Tuesdays. I want to tell you this one because it doesn't fit the pattern of a person doing something. That's what I keep coming back to. This was a different kind of thing. It was the summer of 2018. I'm a consultant, or I was, until I went fully remote, and I travelled a lot, and I'd gotten used to every variety of motel, highway food and gas station stop that exists in the southeastern United States. I don't spook easily in those situations. I'd had my share of uncomfortable encounters, and I had a pretty calibrated sense of when something was actually off, versus when it was just the general mild weirdness of being a stranger in a place. I had my dog with me on this trip, a lab mix named Chester, 8 years old, about 70 pounds of the most reliably unruffled animal I've ever encountered. Chester had been in cars for his entire life. He slept through traffic jams. He did not react to other dogs, or strangers, or unusual sounds, or much of anything. He was the psychological bedrock of that car trip. We stopped at a gas station in rural Georgia in the late afternoon. I'd guess around 5:30. The light was that stretched out gold of early evening. The station was attached to an auto shop with 2 garage bays that had already closed for the day. The pumps were out front, the shop was off to the right, and behind the property, starting maybe 40 feet from the back edge of the lot, was a tree line. Pine trees, dense, the kind of southern pine forest that goes from sunlit to dark very quickly once you're more than a few feet in. I pulled up to the right pump, got out, and opened the back door of the car to let Chester get some air while I pumped. He liked to stick his head out. He didn't stick his head out. He started barking the moment I opened the door. Not at me, I wasn't between him and whatever he was looking at. He was pressed into the far corner of the back seat, body angled toward the rear window, barking in a way I'd never heard from him. Sustained, escalating, with something underneath it that I can only describe as desperate. Chester had 3 modes: happy, sleeping, and mildly curious. This was none of those things. This was an animal in a state I hadn't known he was capable of. I looked at the tree line. I could see the pine trunks in the long evening light, the shadows between them, the edge where the mowed lot grass became pine duff and shadow. I didn't see anything obvious. Chester was shaking. I want to say that again because it still gets to me. That dog shook once in 8 years during a particularly bad thunderstorm that had lightning striking very close to the house. He was shaking now. I looked at the tree line again, slower this time, and at the point where the direct sunlight gave out and the shadow started, right at that exact boundary, there was something that was not a tree. I can't describe it better than that, and I've tried. It was the right general height to be a person. It was darker than the trees around it in a way that didn't track with how the light was falling. And it was still. Everything else at the tree line had some movement to it, the upper branches, shadows shifting, but this thing was completely still. The proportions were wrong. I've gone back and forth on this because I know how suggestion works, and I know how light and shadow and a scared dog can make your brain do things. But the proportions were wrong in a way that I noticed before I'd processed why. The way you notice a word is misspelled before you've actually read which letter is off. I pumped gas faster than I have before or since. Chester stayed pressed against the far side of the back seat, still barking, until I got back in the car. Then he climbed into the front passenger seat, which was not allowed and which he'd never done unprompted in 8 years, and pressed his entire body against my side. He kept his eyes on the tree line as I turned around in the lot. He kept watching it as we pulled out. He watched until it was out of sight, and then he finally stopped shaking, and he put his head on my leg, and he didn't move for another hour of driving. I've thought about this one a lot. Chester could perceive things I couldn't in several documented ways: contrast sensitivity in low light, motion detection in peripheral vision, the ability to hear frequencies I couldn't. He saw the whole picture. I saw the edge of it, and the edge of it was enough to make me not want to know what the whole picture looked like. I lost Chester in 2021. I still think about that tree line when I drive through Georgia. This one is short, and it's not about something supernatural. I don't know what it is about exactly. That's why I keep thinking about it. It was December of 2017, a Thursday. I'd been at a work holiday party and I'd left early. I'm not a party person, and I was sober, and I needed gas before getting on the highway because I knew myself well enough to know I'd forget in the morning. So I stopped at a BP near a main intersection around 10:30 at night. The lot was strangely empty for that time and location. It was a busy street. Usually there'd be 4 or 5 cars. That night it was just me and one other car, a small dark hatchback at the pump catty corner to mine. The woman at the hatchback was standing outside by her car, not pumping gas, just standing there with her arms crossed and her eyes on the road. I was staring at the price tick up on my pump when she spoke. I didn't catch it the first time. "Sorry?" I said. She said it again. I just needed someone to be here for a minute. She said it very steadily. Not frantic, not dramatic. I think someone's been following me since the highway exit. I took this exit to see if they'd follow. They did. They drove past the lot though. She nodded toward the main road without looking at me. I said, "Are you okay right now?" She said yes. She just wanted to wait a few minutes. She said it in the way you say something when you've already thought it through and made a decision and you just need the environment to cooperate. I kept my pump running. We stood there. We talked a little, not about the situation, just filler, the way strangers talk when they're waiting on something together. The weather, how the pump at her spot was running slow. About 4 minutes in, a dark SUV came through the intersection. It was going slowly, too slowly for the light, too slowly for the amount of traffic, the kind of slow where you're looking, not driving. The woman and I both looked at it. It went through the intersection and turned right, out of our view. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "That's it." She waited another minute or so, then said, "I'm going somewhere else, somewhere open. Thank you." She got in her car and went left out of the lot, away from the highway. I waited another few minutes before I left. I didn't know what else to do. I think about her sometimes. I don't know her name, I don't know where she was going or where she'd come from, and I don't know whether she got there. I've checked the area news intermittently in the months after, just the local crime blotter, looking for anything. I've never found anything that matches. I don't know if that's good. I genuinely don't know. I managed the overnight at a Chevron station on a 2-lane highway in central New Mexico. Rural doesn't cover it. We were 18 miles from the nearest town with a stoplight. We served truckers, people making long cuts through the desert, and occasionally someone who looked like they'd been driving for 2 days without stopping, and whose eyes had a particular glazed flatness that desert driving produces. It was a lonely job and a strange one, and I won't pretend I always felt completely comfortable out there at 3 a.m. when the highway was silent for 15 minutes at a stretch. But the thing that unnerved me most had nothing to do with any of the customers. It started with the walk-in cooler. Standard commercial setup, heavy insulated door, latch handle on the outside, light switch just inside the door frame on the right. The cooler held beer, soda, water, a few other things. I went in multiple times per shift to pull stock. For 3 consecutive nights in the same week, same shift, same rough timing, I arrived to find the cooler light on and I left to find it off. The light should work opposite to that. I turn it on when I go in, off when I leave. It has one switch. I asked my co-workers if anyone had been going into the cooler without telling me and not turning the light off properly. Nobody claimed it. I checked the switch. Nothing obviously wrong. I checked the door seal, thinking maybe the light was triggered by heat or air pressure somehow, but it wasn't that kind of system. It was a toggle switch, and it toggled 2 directions, on or off. After a few days, I put it out of my mind, but about 2 weeks later, I went into the cooler to pull stock at 3 am, and there was a smell I couldn't identify. Not the usual cold storage smell. Underneath it, underneath the recycled cold air, something like wet soil or old copper, metallic and earthy at the same time. I pulled my stock fast, got out, latched the door. I mentioned the smell the next morning to the day manager, almost as an aside. She didn't respond right away. She stood there for a second with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and then she said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words, "Has anyone been coming around from the back property lately?" I told her I'd seen a few people cut through the back lot. It happened occasionally. The back lot connected to a service road. She said, "There used to be another structure on this lot. Before this chevron. A smaller station. The owners closed it maybe 8-9 years ago. They built over the foundation when they put this one up, but they didn't dig out everything underneath." She said this the way you say something that's meant to explain another thing. I nodded like I understood. I didn't understand. I've never fully understood what she meant by it, or what she thought it had to do with the smell or the light. The last night before I moved to day shift, I went into the cooler at 3:10 am. The light was already on. I stood in the doorway for a moment, telling myself it was the switch quirk again, the thing I'd never been able to figure out. Then I stepped in. There was a handprint on the inside face of the door, not smudged, not partial. A full handprint, palm and all 4 fingers, made from someone pressing against the door from inside, which means it was made by someone standing in the cooler, pressing against the door from the inside. It was small, noticeably smaller than mine, and I have small hands, smaller than any of my employees. I finished my shift. I didn't go back in alone after that, not once, not for the remaining 8 days before I transitioned shifts. I always asked someone else to come in with me, and I always said I just needed help carrying something. Nobody pushed back. Nobody asked why. I think about that too. I was 24. It was January, upstate New York, the kind of January that makes you genuinely re-examine your life choices. We're talking 8 degrees Fahrenheit and a wind out of the northwest that made it feel like -20. I was driving a '09 Civic that had been struggling through the winter, and about 60 miles outside of where I was going, the engine temperature gauge spiked and something started steaming under the hood, and I pulled off the highway. The only visible building was a gas station. It was dark, no interior lights, no pump lights. A handwritten note taped inside the door said closed until March. Seasonal closure, which happens upstate. I checked my phone for cell service. No bars, which I knew there was a known dead zone on that stretch of highway. No cars passed for the first 10 minutes I stood there. I got back in my car. The engine had died, but the battery still worked, so I had heat for a little while. I sat there and thought through my options, which were basically wait for a car to come by and hope they stop, or start walking. which in that temperature was genuinely dangerous. About 40 minutes in, headlights, I got out and stood near the pump. Visible, it was a pickup truck, the heavy older kind that farm people drive, and it pulled in and the window came down. The man driving looked about 60, weathered face, hunting jacket, no hat despite the cold. He asked what the problem was with the kind of directness people use when they have no time to waste. I told him. Engine overheated. The car was dead. He said he'd call a tow for me from a number he had. He had cell service on a different carrier, and that while he did, I should wait inside the station because sitting in a car in that temperature with no running engine was going to become a problem. I said the station was closed. He said, "There's a side door." He was already handing me something, a key, on a keychain that had a small blue LED flashlight on it. He said to use the lights on the back wall only, not the front ones, because the front lights were visible from the road and he didn't want anyone thinking the place was open and pulling over. Then he drove around the back of the property to make his call. I found the side door. It was on the right side of the building, set back a little, not visible from the pump area. The key fit. The door opened into what looked like a break room or storage area, a folding table, a couple of mismatched chairs, metal shelving with some old product boxes. The lights he'd mentioned were along the back wall, 2 old cage-style fluorescent fixtures. I found the switch for those and left the front ones dark. It was warmer inside. I sat in one of the chairs and looked around the room, the way you do in a quiet, unfamiliar space, taking stock of things. There was writing on the wall above the shelving, a name, written in black marker, just a first name. I'm not going to write it here, I'm going to say it was a woman's name, a simple one, a common one. It had been written many times. I counted at some point during the hour I sat there, somewhere between 30 and 40 repetitions, same handwriting each time. It started at the top of the wall, above the shelving, in large letters, maybe 4 inches tall, and it repeated over and over down the wall, but each repetition was slightly smaller than the one before it, large at the top, then smaller, the handwriting getting more compressed and careful looking as it descended, until the last several near the floor were barely an inch tall and you had to lean in to read them. And then they stopped. Not at the floor, higher than the floor, like whoever was writing had simply stopped, mid-wall, and hadn't continued. I sat in that room for about an hour. The old man waited outside in his truck. He never came in. When the tow truck arrived, the old man left without saying much. I didn't get his name. I didn't even think to ask, which I've regretted since. On the way to the nearest shop, I asked the tow driver about the station. He said it had been closed for a couple of years, not a seasonal closure, a permanent one. He said there had been a situation there a few years back, and the family that owned it had decided not to reopen. He said it the way you say something you don't want to elaborate on. His voice changed when he said a situation. It went flat and careful, the same way my mother's voice had gone all those years ago when I'd asked about the Shell station in our town, the way she'd said there was just some trouble. I've been thinking about those 2 phrases for a long time. A situation, some trouble. The deliberate vagueness of adults who know something specific and have decided not to tell you. Whatever happened in that station, at least 2 people I've met in my life knew about it, and neither of them would say what it was. I don't know whose name was written on that wall. I was 24. It was January, upstate New York, the kind of January that makes you genuinely re-examine your life choices. We're talking 8 degrees Fahrenheit and a wind out of the northwest that made it feel like -20. I was driving a '09 Civic that had been struggling through the winter and about 60 miles outside of where I was going. The engine temperature gauge spiked and something started steaming under the hood, and I pulled off the highway. The only visible building was a gas station. It was dark, no interior lights, no pump lights. A hand-written note taped inside the door said closed until March. Seasonal closure, which happens upstate. I checked my phone for cell service. No bars, which I knew. There was a known dead zone on that stretch of highway. No cars passed for the first 10 minutes I stood there. I got back in my car. The engine had died, but the battery still worked, so I had heat for a little while. I sat there and thought through my options, which were basically wait for a car to come by and hope they stop, or start walking, which in that temperature was genuinely dangerous. About 40 minutes in, headlights, I got out and stood near the pump. Visible, it was a pickup truck, the heavy older kind that farm people drive, and it pulled in and the window came down. The man driving looked about 60, weathered face, hunting jacket, no hat despite the cold. He asked what the problem was with the kind of directness people use when they have no time to waste. I told him. Engine overheated. The car was dead. He said he'd call a tow for me from a number he had. He had cell service on a different carrier, and that while he did, I should wait inside the station, because sitting in a car in that temperature with no running engine was going to become a problem. I said the station was closed. He said, there's a side door. He was already handing me something, a key, on a keychain that had a small blue LED flashlight on it. He said to use the lights on the back wall only, not the front ones, because the front lights were visible from the road and he didn't want anyone thinking the place was open and pulling over. Then he drove around the back of the property to make his call. I found the side door. It was on the right side of the building, set back a little, not visible from the pump area. The key fit. The door opened into what looked like a break room or storage area. A folding table, a couple of mismatched chairs, metal shelving with some old product boxes. The lights he'd mentioned were along the back wall. 2 old cage-style fluorescent fixtures. I found the switch for those and left the front ones dark. It was warmer inside. I sat in one of the chairs and looked around the room, the way you do in a quiet, unfamiliar space, taking stock of things. There was writing on the wall above the shelving, a name, written in black marker, just a first name. I'm not going to write it here, I'm going to say it was a woman's name, a simple one, a common one. It had been written many times. I counted at some point during the hour I sat there, somewhere between 30 and 40 repetitions, same handwriting each time. It started at the top of the wall, above the shelving, in large letters, maybe 4 inches tall, and it repeated over and over down the wall, but each repetition was slightly smaller than the one before it. Large at the top, then smaller, the handwriting getting more compressed and careful looking as it descended, until the last several near the floor were barely an inch tall and you had to lean in to read them. And then they stopped, not at the floor, higher than the floor, like whoever was writing had simply stopped mid-wall and hadn't continued. I sat in that room for about an hour. The old man waited outside in his truck. He never came in. When the tow truck arrived, the old man left without saying much. I didn't get his name. I didn't even think to ask, which I've regretted since. On the way to the nearest shop, I asked the tow driver about the station. He said it had been closed for a couple of years, not a seasonal closure, a permanent one. He said there had been a situation there a few years back, and the family that owned it had decided not to reopen. He said it the way you say something you don't want to elaborate on. His voice changed when he said a situation. It went flat and careful, the same way my mother's voice had gone all those years ago when I'd asked about the Shell station in our town, the way she'd said, "There was just some trouble." I've been thinking about those two phrases for a long time. A situation, some trouble, the deliberate vagueness of adults who know something specific and have decided not to tell you. Whatever happened in that station, at least 2 people I've met in my life knew about it, and neither of them would say what it was. I don't know whose name was written on that wall. If you've made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you, genuinely. There's something about the gas station as a place that I think makes it a perfect container for this kind of story. It exists in a no-man's land. It's designed for transition, for people who are between one place and another, nobody quite at home, nobody quite paying attention, and things that want to go unnoticed tend to find places like that and settle in. 10 stations, 10 stories, none of them resolved. If you want more nights like this one, the subscribe button's right there. Stay safe out there. Watch the tree lines. Good night.